the unseen companion. The Appalachian Mountains were as tranquil as Lisa had hoped. As someone who thrived on solitude, the idea of hiking alone through the winding trails was both thrilling and therapeutic. Armed with a map, a sturdy backpack, and her trusty boots, she embarked on what she planned to be a 3-day excursion. The first day passed without incident. The trail was serene, lined with autumn-colored leaves, and the soft crunch under her boots was the only sound accompanying her. Occasionally, she stopped to admire the view or to snap a photo, feeling completely at peace with nature. By the evening, she reached a designated campsite, where she set up her small tent and cooked a simple meal over a portable stove. As night fell, the forest became eerily quiet. It wasn't unusual. Lisa knew the animals often grew silent in the presence of humans, but the silence felt heavy. Shrugging it off as her imagination, she settled in for the night. She woke up suddenly around midnight. At first, she didn't know what had stirred her. Then she heard it, a soft crunching sound, as if something was walking just outside her tent. She held her breath, heart pounding, and listened. Crunch, crunch, crunch. The steps were slow, deliberate. They circled her tent once, then stopped. Lisa reached for her flashlight, unzipped the tent just slightly, and shone the light outside. Nothing. Probably an animal, she whispered to herself, though her voice trembled. She lay back down, trying to dismiss the unease, and eventually fell asleep again. The next morning, she stepped outside and inspected the ground. There were no tracks, no signs of anything having walked near her tent. Shrugging off the odd experience, she packed up and resumed her hike. As the day wore on, Lisa couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. It started with the faint sound of footsteps. At first, she thought it was an echo of her own steps, but the rhythm was off. Sometimes the steps would continue when she stopped. She spun around several times, scanning the trail behind her. The woods were empty, the silence interrupted only by the occasional bird call. Still, the sensation of being watched prickled her skin. By the time she reached her second campsite, the feeling had intensified. She pitched her tent quickly, ate a cold meal, and climbed inside, too uneasy to linger outside. The night was darker than before, with thick clouds obscuring the moonlight. It started again around midnight, the crunching footsteps. But this time, they didn't circle her tent. Instead, they stopped directly in front of it. Lisa froze, her breath caught in her throat. "Hello?" she called, her voice shaking. No response. Summoning her courage, she grabbed her flashlight and unzipped the tent just enough to peer outside. The beam of light illuminated nothing but empty woods. Reluctantly, she closed the tent and tried to sleep, but it was a restless night. The footsteps never returned, but the oppressive feeling of being watched remained. The next morning, as she packed her things, Lisa noticed something unusual. Near the spot where the footsteps had stopped, there was an old photograph lying on the ground. She picked it up, her stomach twisting. The photo was black and white, frayed at the edges, and depicted a group of people standing on a trail. In the background, barely visible, was a shadowy figure among the trees. Her hands trembled as she stuffed the photo into her pocket and hastily began her hike back toward civilization. The footsteps followed her the entire way. The Rocky Mountains had always drawn adventurers with their untamed beauty, and for Tim, hiking alone was his way of reconnecting with nature. He prided himself on his ability to navigate the wilderness and had often said that the silence of the forest felt more like home than the bustling city. This time, he had chosen a less traveled trail leading to an isolated peak. The first day of his hike was uneventful, filled with breathtaking views and the soothing sound of the wind rustling through the trees. But as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows over the terrain, Tim noticed something odd. A light flickered in the distance, like a lantern swaying gently in the breeze. At first, he thought it might be another hiker or camper, though he hadn't seen anyone all day. Curious, he decided to move closer. As he descended toward the light, it seemed to retreat, always staying just out of reach. "Hello?" he called out, his voice echoing off the surrounding cliffs. No response. By the time he reached the area where the light had been, darkness had fully enveloped the forest. Frustrated and disoriented, Tim decided to set up camp for the night. He built a small fire and tried to shake the uneasy feeling creeping into his mind. It was around midnight when he saw the light again. This time, it was closer, flickering through the trees like a firefly. Grabbing his flashlight, Tim stepped cautiously away from his campsite, following the glow. The ground was uneven, the dense forest closing in around him. Every few steps, he paused, listening to the silence, his breath visible in the cool night air. The light led him to a clearing. In the center was an old, weathered cabin he hadn't noticed before. It looked abandoned, its roof partially collapsed and the windows shattered. Yet the lantern light glowed warmly from within. Tim hesitated. His instincts screamed at him to turn back, but his curiosity was overpowering. Slowly, he approached the cabin, his boots crunching against the frost-laden grass. "Hello? Is someone there?" he called again. The light flickered once, twice, then extinguished. The clearing was plunged into darkness. Tim's heart pounded in his chest as he fumbled with his flashlight. The beam of light cut through the shadows, revealing the cabin's gaping doorway. Tentatively, he stepped inside. The interior was as decrepit as the outside. Broken furniture littered the floor, and the air was thick with the smell of decay. A tattered journal lay open on a table, its pages yellowed with age. Tim flipped through it, but the writing was indecipherable, just faint, faded scrawls. Suddenly, a noise behind him made him freeze. A low creak, like a footstep on old wood. Tim spun around, his flashlight sweeping the room. Nothing. He bolted out of the cabin, his pulse racing. The forest seemed darker than before, the trees looming like shadowy sentinels. In his panic, he realized he had lost his bearings. The trail back to his campsite was nowhere to be found. As he wandered, the lantern light appeared again, bobbing gently through the trees. This time, Tim didn't follow it. Instead, he turned in the opposite direction and ran, his breath ragged and his legs burning. The light reappeared ahead of him, closer now. No matter which way he turned, it always seemed to cut off his path. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Tim couldn't tell anymore. Exhausted, he collapsed against a tree, his body trembling. The lantern light hovered in the distance, unmoving for the first time. When dawn finally broke, the light vanished, and the forest seemed to exhale, releasing him from its grip. Tim stumbled back to his campsite, packed his gear in a frenzy, and left the mountain without looking back. Later, he learned that the trail he had taken passed through an area with a dark history, a settlement abandoned after a series of mysterious disappearances. Some said the lantern belonged to the spirit of a searcher who had lost their way, forever doomed to wander the woods. Tim didn't care for the explanation. He never hiked alone again. Whispers on the wind. The Scottish Highlands were vast and desolate, their windswept beauty drawing travelers from around the world. For Eleanor, a seasoned hiker, they were the perfect escape. She had always found the solitude of the mountains comforting, a place to silence the noise of her busy life. This trip was different. A friend had warned her that the stretch of trail she was taking, near Glencoe, was notorious for its eerie atmosphere and unsettling legends. But Eleanor wasn't one to believe in ghost stories. The first day of her trek was uneventful. She climbed steep hills and navigated narrow paths, the rugged beauty of the highlands stretching endlessly before her. By the time she reached a flat, secluded area to set up camp, she felt a sense of accomplishment. That night, as she lay in her tent, the wind howled through the valley, carrying with it a strange sound. At first, she thought it was just the wind playing tricks on her ears. But then she realized it wasn't just a sound. It was a voice. Faint and indistinct, it seemed to whisper just beyond the range of her comprehension. "Hello," Eleanor called, unzipping her tent and shining her flashlight into the darkness. The beam illuminated nothing but the surrounding heather and rocks. The voice faded, replaced by the steady hum of the wind. Shaking her head, Eleanor crawled back into her sleeping bag, convincing herself it was her imagination. The next day, she continued her hike, climbing higher into the hills. As she ascended, the whispers returned, carried on the wind like a haunting melody. They were louder now, still unintelligible but undeniably human. Stopping in her tracks, Eleanor scanned the landscape. There was no one in sight, just the rolling hills and the occasional lonely tree. A chill ran down her spine, but she pressed on, determined to reach her next campsite before nightfall. By the time she pitched her tent, the whispers had become constant, a faint chorus in the background. They seemed to grow louder when she stopped moving, urging her to keep going, though she didn't understand the words. That night, she couldn't sleep. The voices were too close, as if they were right outside her tent. Heart racing, she peeked out again, expecting to see someone, or something, standing there. But the darkness revealed nothing. Determined to put an end to the strange experience, Eleanor decided to pack up and leave at first light. But as dawn broke, the whispers didn't fade. They grew louder, now unmistakably forming words. "Don't look back." She froze, every hair on her body standing on end. The voice was clear, urgent, and spoken directly into her ear. Eleanor ran. She didn't care about the weight of her pack or the uneven terrain. All she wanted was to get away. The whispers chased her, now rising into a cacophony of overlapping voices. "Don't look back." Despite the warning, her fear got the better of her. She glanced over her shoulder. What she saw made her stumble. A line of figures stood in the distance, their forms shrouded in mist. They were motionless, their faces obscured, but she could feel their eyes on her, cold and piercing. Eleanor scrambled to her feet and kept running. The voices continued, growing fainter as she put more distance between herself and the figures. When she finally reached the safety of her car, parked at the edge of the trail, she collapsed into the driver's seat, shaking and out of breath. The whispers were gone, replaced by the familiar sounds of the living world. Eleanor later learned that the area she had hiked was known as the Valley of the Lost, where, according to legend, the spirits of a long-forgotten battle still roamed, warning travelers not to disturb their rest. She never returned to the highlands, and the haunting chorus of whispers stayed with her long after she left. The descent into shadows. The Grand Canyon was a place of awe-inspiring beauty, its vast chasms and towering cliffs a reminder of nature's immense power. For Alex, it was the perfect destination for an adventurous solo hike. He had prepared meticulously, choosing a lesser-known trail to avoid the usual crowds. The trail, called Shadow's Edge, was rumored to be challenging but rewarding, offering unparalleled views of the canyon at its deepest points. Alex wasn't superstitious and brushed off the ominous name as a marketing gimmick to attract thrill-seekers. The first day of his hike was everything he'd hoped for. The landscape was stunning, the weather ideal, and the solitude invigorating. He made good progress, stopping occasionally to snap photos or admire the breathtaking scenery. As the sun began to set, he set up camp on a small plateau overlooking the canyon. The sky turned vibrant shades of orange and pink before fading to a deep indigo. Alex felt a sense of peace as he gazed at the stars, the vast emptiness around him making him feel both small and alive. That peace was shattered around midnight. He woke suddenly, unsure of what had stirred him. The night was eerily silent, the usual sounds of crickets and rustling leaves absent. Then he noticed it, a faint scratching noise, like something scraping against stone. Alex unzipped his tent and shone his flashlight around. The beam illuminated nothing unusual, just rocks, sparse vegetation, and the gaping void of the canyon. The sound stopped. "Probably an animal," he muttered to himself, crawling back into his sleeping bag. But the scratching returned, louder this time. It seemed to be coming from below the plateau. Against his better judgment, Alex decided to investigate. Grabbing his flashlight, he stepped cautiously to the edge of the cliff. What he saw made his stomach drop. Carved into the rock face were strange, spiraling symbols that hadn't been there during the day. The markings seemed to glisten faintly, as if wet, and they formed a trail leading further down the canyon. A chill ran through him. He knew better than to ignore his instincts, and every fiber of his being screamed at him to leave. But curiosity won out. He decided to follow the markings, telling himself he'd only go a short distance before turning back. The trail grew steeper and narrower as he descended, the symbols becoming more elaborate and disturbing. They depicted shadowy figures with elongated limbs and hollow eyes, their forms twisted and unnatural. The deeper Alex went, the darker it became. Even though his watch said it was hours from dawn, his flashlight flickered, and the air grew colder. The scratching noise grew louder, now accompanied by faint whispers that seemed to echo from the canyon walls. "Turn back," the whispers seemed to say, though the words were distorted, almost unintelligible. Alex stopped in his tracks, his chest tightening with fear. He shone his flashlight ahead and froze. A figure stood in the path. It was tall and thin, its form blending with the shadows. Its head tilted unnaturally as if observing him, and its eyes, if it had any, were voids of darkness. Alex stumbled backward, nearly losing his footing. The figure didn't move, but the whispers grew louder, overlapping in a chaotic chorus. "Turn back! Turn back!" Heart pounding, Alex turned and scrambled back up the trail. The ascent was grueling, his legs burning with effort and his lungs gasping for air. He didn't dare look back, but he could feel the figure's presence, as if it were right behind him. When he finally reached his campsite, the sky was beginning to lighten. The symbols were gone, the strange noises replaced by the normal sounds of the waking wilderness. Alex didn't waste time packing his things. He abandoned the rest of his route and hiked back to the main trailhead as fast as his legs would carry him. Later, he learned that Shadow's Edge was avoided by locals, who spoke of a cursed tribe that once inhabited the area. They were said to have been driven mad by the canyon's isolation, their spirits now lingering in the shadows. Alex couldn't explain what he'd seen, but he knew one thing for certain. He would never set foot in the Grand Canyon again. The Silent Watcher. Maggie was no stranger to hiking alone. She found the solitude comforting, a chance to clear her head and escape from the noise of her everyday life. This time, she had chosen an unfamiliar trail in Vermont's Green Mountains, drawn by promises of stunning views and serene forests. The hike began like any other. The trail wound through dense woods, the canopy above forming a patchwork of sunlight and shadow. The air was crisp, and the distant sounds of birdsong accompanied her every step. About halfway through the hike, Maggie noticed something strange. The forest had grown unnaturally quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, nothing. It was as if the woods were holding their breath. She shook off her unease and kept walking. But then, she felt it. A prickling sensation on the back of her neck, as if she were being watched. Maggie stopped and turned, scanning the trees. There was nothing unusual, just the dense underbrush and towering trunks. But the feeling wouldn't go away. She pressed on, her pace quickening. The trail grew steeper, the dense forest giving way to rocky outcroppings. At one point, she stumbled, and when she looked down, she noticed something odd. Imprints in the dirt. They were faint but unmistakable footprints. The problem was, they weren't hers. They were larger, and the spacing suggested whoever made them had an unusually long stride. Maggie's heart raced as she looked around, but again, she saw nothing. She considered turning back but convinced herself it was just another hiker who had passed earlier. The trail eventually led to a clearing with a breathtaking view of the valley below. Maggie set her pack down and tried to relax, soaking in the beauty of the moment. The unease she'd felt earlier began to fade, replaced by a sense of calm, until she saw it. Across the clearing, just beyond the tree line, a figure stood. It was tall, unnaturally so, and entirely still, its form partially obscured by shadows. Maggie squinted, trying to make out more details, but the figure didn't move. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling slightly. No response. She grabbed her binoculars from her pack and looked through them. Her breath caught in her throat. The figure was wearing what looked like tattered clothing, its face hidden beneath a hood. But what truly unnerved her was its posture. Rigid and unnatural, as if it were a mannequin propped up in the woods. Maggie lowered the binoculars and blinked. When she looked again, the figure was gone. A wave of dread washed over her. She didn't hear it move, didn't see any signs of disturbance in the foliage. It was just gone. Deciding it was time to leave, Maggie packed up her things and started back down the trail. The feeling of being watched returned. Stronger now. She kept glancing over her shoulder, her nerves on edge. As she descended, she noticed the footprints again. They were fresher now, and they weren't leading away, they were following her. Maggie broke into a run, her pack bouncing against her back. The forest seemed to close in around her, the shadows growing darker despite the midday sun. She could hear faint rustling behind her, but every time she looked, the trail was empty. When she finally reached her car at the trailhead, she threw her pack in the back seat and locked the doors, her hands trembling. As she started the engine and pulled onto the road, she glanced in the rearview mirror. For a split second, she thought she saw the figure standing at the edge of the trailhead, watching her leave. Maggie never went hiking in the Green Mountains again. Months later, she stumbled across a local legend about the area. A tale of a silent watcher who roamed the woods, following those who ventured too far off the beaten path. She still couldn't explain what she'd seen, but the memory of that figure stayed with her, a reminder of how fragile the boundary between the known and the unknown truly is.